Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. Today, we're talking to Dr. Christine Gabardo, the co-founder and CTO of CERT Systems. CERT Systems is on a mission to produce essential chemicals without fossil fuels. Their technology takes CO2 and turns it into sustainable, high-value chemicals like ethylene, using just water and electricity. Chemicals like ethylene aren't something we think about a lot, but they're a building block for everyday life. It's used to make just about everything from plastic, shampoo, textiles, and even building materials. But ethylene is typically made from fossil fuels and spews between 1 to 2 tons of carbon pollution for every ton that's produced. CERT's technology is able to actually make ethylene from the carbon capture systems that are installed at industrial plants and turn that pollution into a useful, high-value product that's actually locking away up to 5 tons of carbon for every ton that they make. The CERT team was a finalist at the Carbon XPRIZE and were the first in the world to demonstrate the conversion of industrial emissions into ethylene. In our conversation, we unpack how CERT's technology is helping chemical producers turn their emissions into a useful resource, how it could be a pathway for producing sustainable aviation fuel, the lessons that they learned on scaling their technology from the Carbon XPRIZE, why people tend to underestimate the market for sustainable ethylene, and a lot more. Christine, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Justin. Thanks so much for having me today.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. So I would love to maybe start with a bit about your background. So you've been working on CERT for a couple of years now. How did you find yourself starting CERT Systems?
Sure. So my background is in engineering. I did my undergrad and PhD at McMaster. And during my PhD, I became fascinated with how we can use electrochemistry to solve some of the world's biggest challenges. At the time, I was working on designing electrochemical biosensors for diagnostic applications. And then after my PhD, I joined the University of Toronto, and that was for my postdoc. And I joined at a time where they had just launched a new research program looking at, in a world where we have abundant renewable electricity, how can we use that to continue to decarbonize the world? And so we started working on CO2 utilization there, and specifically looking at CO2 reduction powered through electrolysis. And so I started working on devices, trying to make them more efficient and scalable and stable. Through that research, we actually were also part of the NRG COSIA Carbon XPRIZE. So when I joined, we had advanced to the finals of that competition as a research group. And I stepped in as the technical lead for the finals of that competition. So taking what we had developed in the lab and scaling that up 10,000 times and deploying it at an industrial site where we were converting carbon dioxide that had been captured from a natural gas power plant into ethylene for the first time. And so through that piloting activity, we were able to see that we could actually scale this process and deploy it outside of the lab. And so after that competition, we spun out from university and started CERT Systems to try to bring this technology to market.
That's a pretty incredible time to join this research group and jump into the thick of things in the middle of an XPRIZE competition.
Definitely.
What was that experience like?
It was pretty wild because we were a group of researchers. We hadn't really had experience outside of the lab, and we had to tackle all sides of the project. So it was a really great learning experience. I think one thing that we did really well was focus on our technology. So we focused on the electrolyzer and developing and scaling that. And then we worked with partners to help scale the balance of plant and everything that goes around the electrolyzer. So we were working in parallel with an engineering firm that designed a modular plant for us. And we developed all of the electrolysis components ourselves. And so by working in parallel with the engineering firm, we were able to scale up, I think, much faster than if we had tried to tackle all components together.
Yeah, that's a really interesting program where you kind of get that outside support and kind of focus on your strengths.
Exactly.
So I think that's a good segue to talk about the technology and kind of what you're building. So
Sure.
In any world where we're, effectively addressing climate change, we have to draw down gigatons of CO2 and capture it. And I think for a lot of people, kind of the default, what to do with that, the default is storing it underground. I think there's a lot of talk about sequestration, but you're kind of taking a different approach where you're actually taking something like we don't need, taking pollution and turning it into something useful. Can you talk about kind of like what is that electrolysis process and kind of, just break down like what you're doing to turn CO2 into some of these chemicals?
Yeah, so I guess maybe to zoom out a little bit, chemical production contributes to significant emissions, close to 1 gigaton per year. And we currently rely on fossil fuel feedstocks to produce all the essential chemicals that our society relies on. And so what we're doing is kind of tackling both the feedstock issue with that and the emission issue. And so we are converting carbon dioxide into these valuable chemicals and fuels using renewable electricity. And this is through, as you mentioned, an electrolysis technology. So we're using electricity to drive chemical reactions that split apart carbon dioxide and water molecules and reform them into base hydrocarbons like ethylene. And ethylene, I guess, is our major product. And this is a key building block for many of our downstream products that we use every day, such as polymers, textiles, building materials. And so it's a massive market. It's one of the top 3 chemicals produced in the world, 200 megatons per year. And so if we are able to decarbonize ethylene production, we can decarbonize all those downstream products as well. Current ethylene production is done through steam cracking of naphtha or natural gas, and that emits 1 to 2 tons of CO2 per ton of ethylene that's produced. In our process, because we're using CO2 as a feedstock, we're actually consuming 3 tons of CO2 for every ton of ethylene that we produce. And so there's a net difference there of up to 5 tons of CO2 avoided with our product.
Yeah, that was a number that really jumped out when I was doing some research on CERT. Just the fact that you're drawing down 3 tons for every ton produced seems like, and producing something valuable. Like it seems just like a big unlock in terms of both addressing emissions and producing things that we need for, everyday life. So what does that process kind of actually look like if we were to kind of drill down into the process itself?
So it's a direct electrolysis process, and it looks similar to electrolysis that's used for green hydrogen production.
Oh, yeah.
So you have an electrolyzer stack with multiple electrolyzer cells, and each cell has a membrane electrode assembly, which has proprietary catalysts, which can then activate those carbon dioxide and water molecules. And in a single step, we convert it into ethylene.
Gotcha. Okay. And so this seems like, huge market potential. Who are some of the kind of ideal customers that you would be targeting for this kind of technology?
Yeah, so we're currently targeting conventional petrochemical manufacturers and as well as ethylene users. So they have emissions from their current production, as well as long-living infrastructure that has billions of dollars invested. And so they're looking at ways that they can decarbonize their facilities without a massive overhaul of existing infrastructure. And so what we can offer is a way to take their emissions, produce ethylene that feeds directly into all their downstream infrastructure that they already have, because we're producing a chemically identical molecule to what's conventionally produced through fossil-derived ethylene. And then for downstream users of ethylene, what we're offering is exactly the same product. So they're not compromising on the quality of what they're offering their customers. One unique feature of CO2 electrolysis are the feedstocks. So CO2, water, electricity, we're not reliant on fossil fuel inputs. And so that helps enable the local production of ethylene where it's needed, which also helps de-risk supply chains for ethylene users that may be importing ethylene into their country right now. And it also provides access to new markets, such as sustainable aviation fuel. So ethylene is an intermediate along the alcohol to jet pathway. So if you can go directly from carbon dioxide to ethylene, you can skip the alcohol step and go directly to jet fuel through oligomerization. And so that's another pathway that's unlocked with this technology.
Interesting. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Because that seems like a really sustainable aviation fuel seems like a very hard nut to crack in terms of like enough supply and all of that. Could you expand on how that could then turn into sustainable aviation fuel?
Yeah, sure. So one of the pathways for sustainable aviation fuel is going through ethanol. And so typically through fermentation processes where sugarcane or corn is fermented and you produce an ethanol product. That ethanol is then convert it into ethylene.
Oh, okay.
And then that ethylene is then oligomerized into sustainable aviation fuel to create those longer chain hydrocarbon products. And so rather than relying on bio feedstocks to produce your ethylene molecule, we can use CO2 directly. And so we're not constrained by land use or the availability of these feedstocks to produce the ethylene intermediate that goes into SAF.
Yeah. Cool. And you're mentioning too the supply chain aspect, and that was something that hadn't really clicked, is that you can actually swap out needing to get access to natural gas and all of that and replace it with, I would imagine CO2 is a much more bountiful kind of input for this kind of stuff. So yeah, maybe could you just unpack that a little bit more, like the supply chain opportunity as well?
Yeah, so some of our partners are currently buying ethylene. They don't produce it to make some of their plastic products, such as PVC. And so what they're really looking at is how can they use their emissions in a way that could produce a feedstock that they are currently buying out of their country in their own operations. That really unlocks being able to produce your own feedstocks without having to rely on external sources.
Yeah. Wow. I would imagine that's incredibly attractive for some of these producers. And then, so in terms of actually integrating your technology into their processes, what does that look like? Like, is it a retrofit? Is it more modular? What's kind of what's the lift to kind of implement this in their systems?
Yeah, so we would be taking their emissions. So we would need a carbon capture system on site. So a lot of our partners are currently looking at what type of carbon capture to implement. And then from there, it would be a modular system that we would just, retrofit onto their site, take that CO2 that's coming off the capture unit, convert it into ethylene, and then that could be fed directly into their own ethylene production or their downstream ethylene derivatives.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of the source for the CO2, so there's carbon capture from kind of industrial processes. Is there an interest or an appetite in also using CO2 that's, atmospheric CO2 from carbon dioxide removal or some of the other sources out there?
Yeah, definitely. I think short term, it will likely be from point sources, but as DAC becomes more prevalent and cheaper, we can definitely take DAC CO2 as well. And that is, I guess, one of the pathways to get to sustainable aviation fuel. Just on an LCA basis, you would need to either use DAC or bio-sourced CO2 for that.
Okay, this is super interesting. So there's kind of two areas of kind of competing uses. So you're competing against other sources of ethylene, and then there's other uses for that CO2. So I would imagine that kind of the unit economics is super important here. Could you talk about how your process kind of stacks up to kind of the more traditional competitors here?
Sure. So for ethylene production, we can look at a few different routes. There's the conventional petrochemical fossil-based ethylene production. There's fossil with CCS. There's bioethylene. So through that ethanol pathway that I mentioned previously, through corn or sugarcane fermentation. And then there's basically maybe first generation CO2 utilization. So taking carbon dioxide, converting that to syngas, converting that to methanol, and then doing a methanol to olefin process. So a multi-step process. And so in terms of our technique, as I mentioned, it's a single step. So that simplifies the process in terms of CapEx. We also don't need any hydrogen feedstocks for our process because we're using water directly. And so that eliminates some of the complexity associated with first generation CO2 utilization. With bioethylene, there are concerns about feedstock constraints, especially accessing the entire market of ethylene. And so in terms of cost competitiveness, we see a path to being cost competitive with fossil-based ethylene, and that's through improving the energy efficiency of our process because it is an electrochemical process, reducing the electricity that we need to operate it, and then also finding clean and inexpensive sources of electricity to power the process is also important.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a major cost driver.
Yeah. Okay. And then so maybe could you talk a little bit about like the cost curve? I'm curious, like how does the price per unit kind of stack up right now? And what is the pathway to driving down that cost curve?
Yeah, so the price per unit right now is about 2 to 3x current fossil-based ethylene prices. And in terms of reducing that, that's going to be improving the energy efficiency of our process, which we're consistently working on increasing. And then also we get some benefits of scale in terms of the mass manufacturing of our systems to reduce the capex of that. And so we don't need to get as large of scale in order to meet that cost competitiveness as fossil-based plants that are currently operating at the 1 megaton per annum capacity, because we do have like a modular solution, but some scale is needed in order to reach that price parity.
Yeah, for sure. So you're mentioning there, I guess one part is to be the energy efficiency and kind of how efficiently that chemical reaction happens. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit? Something that comes up a lot in this area is like conversion and the energy efficiency and energy use. Maybe just talk about how that kind of influences how it's produced and kind of the cost of it.
Sure. So when we look at energy efficiency, there's a few components to that. There's the selectivity of our reactions. So how selectively we can produce ethylene over other molecules in our reactor. And then there's also the voltage that we're operating at. So how much potential energy do we need to drive the reaction? And so there's improvements that we can make on the catalyst side in terms of selectivity. There's improvements on the membrane electrode assembly side in terms of how we can reduce that over potential and any losses within that component. And then there's also other factors like the stability and single pass utilization of CO2. So the stability will impact how often we have to replace catalysts or other components of the electrolyzer. And we want those to be lasting for several years. And so that's critical for scaling and implementing this technology. For the single pass utilization, that's how much CO2 we can convert on a single pass through the electrolyzer. And that really influences how concentrated our products are coming out of the electrolyzer and the separation energy needed for that. So there's a few components that go into energy efficiency, and we've been tackling all of them as we scale up this process.
Yeah. It's interesting that there's so many different angles to that. You mentioned earlier scaling up 10,000 times. And I was reading that originally the reactor was the size of like a Rubik's Cube. Could you maybe just talk about the pathway to scaling up and kind of what are some of the big milestones or unlocks that you've kind of encountered along the way?
Yeah, so when scaling up an electrochemical system, you can scale it up through multiple ways. You can increase the current density, so the reaction per unit area of electrode. You can increase your electrode area or cell size. You can increase the number of cells that you have in a stack, and then you can increase the number of stacks that you have. And so those all come with trade-offs in terms of efficiency, capex, et cetera. And so the way that we scaled up through the XPRIZE was going from a 1 square centimeter cell and increasing that cell size to an 800 square centimeter cell. And then from there, we stacked those cells. So we had 10 of those cells in a stack, and then we had 5 of those stacks on our skid. And so that's how we scaled up, and that worked really well. In terms of the risks with scaling, you see the largest differences when you increase that cell area. And so what we're doing right now is going to our final commercial cell size to de-risk that component of our technology. And then we'll be stacking those cells, which we've done before through the XPRIZE. It's a little less risky, more predictable what to expect there. And so by tackling the cell size first, we feel confident that when we go to the stack level, we'll have good results.
Yeah, that's really interesting that there's some like a couple different levers you can kind of pull to scale up. Somewhat of a tangent, but can you talk about how you identify and think about risk? Because I think, as you're going through the scaling up, what is that process for you and the team in terms of like, okay, how do we identify like what the biggest risk is, which one we want to tackle first or which one we want to tackle next? Maybe just like some of the thought process and like, how do you identify that and break that down?
Yeah, so I think for us, there's a few tools that we use for identifying risk. So we've built our techno-economic model with a bunch of toggles. So all of the inputs that I mentioned, current density, voltage, selectivity, stability, And we've looked at how each of those parameters impact our overall techno-economics, as well as the life cycle assessment of our system.
Okay.
So that gives us the top parameters in terms of sensitivity analysis that we need to tackle first. But we also, with the partners that we're working with through proof of concept projects, these conventional chemical producers, they're giving us insight into what's the most important for them and what parameters they believe are most important for implementing our technology on their sites. And so we're also getting feedback from customers on what's important to them, and that's helping to shape our technology as well.
That's fantastic. I would imagine that that customer insight is incredibly valuable, particularly at this stage. When you're talking to some of these customers, what are some of the big priorities that are coming up for them? Like, what are they excited about when you're talking to them? What are they most concerned about? What do those conversations look like?
So for them, there's a lot of corporate commitments that they have or national commitments that the government has set. And so what they're really excited about is the ability to reduce the carbon intensity of their operations while still being able to maintain the same quality of product that they are currently making. I think the quality is really important when it comes to sustainable alternatives because people want sustainable alternatives, but they're not willing to sacrifice the quality of the product that they already have. And so having a drop-in replacement like ethylene that we offer is one way that's overcoming that quality issue.
Yeah. And then of those kind of partnerships, what have you found to be key to really successful partnerships with some of these, early customers or folks that you're working with?
I think being open and transparent about the technology risks that still remain in the technology, and also asking them a lot of questions and getting their insights on how they currently view technology risk in their own operations and what it would take to actually get our unit onto their site and integrated onto their site. I think there's so much value in discussing how they're currently operating, how they want to be operating in the future, and how they've also implemented new technologies in the past. And so that's been really helpful for us in these partnerships.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Maybe you could share a bit about the business model that you're building around this. Do you see this being more of like a licensing thing? Is this you're selling the module reactors? How are you thinking about kind of that go-to-market approach?
So as we scale, it's going to be a multi-phase commercialization approach. So we'll start with, at our current stage, we're performing paid proof of concept projects with customers and partners, including those major chemical producers. In this way, we can develop our technology and tailor it to meet their needs while still retaining IP rights. And then as we build our commercial units, that will be more of a direct sales of our ethylene product and ethylene derivatives to early adopters, where they're currently paying a premium for lower carbon products because there will still be a price premium compared to fossil-based ethylene. And then as we de-risk our technology, we've reached scale, that's when we're going to be shifting to more of a technology provider model. So partnering with incumbent chemical producers and EPC firms where we will license our IP, sell electrolyzers, and also components to customers that already have the built-in ability to sell those larger volumes of ethylene and ethylene derivatives.
Okay. So in the future, there's a world where you're kind of manufacturing the electrolyzers and selling them to processors and producers of ethylene?
Yeah, that's what we think. And that will be through partnering with engineering companies that have already done these kind of projects in the past.
For sure. Okay. And then what's the long-term vision for CERT Systems? Like if everything goes right, where do you see this ending up?
What we envision is a world where we can produce all the chemicals that we need from CO2 and other sustainable feedstocks. And so really, this is a platform technology. While we're targeting ethylene right now, by changing the catalyst and reaction conditions, you can also target other hydrocarbon products. And so there's a whole suite of chemicals that are accessible through this technology. And so what we'd like to see is a future where all of our chemicals are derived from these sustainable feedstocks rather than from fossil fuels.
Yeah. Something that really speaks to me there and why I thought CERT Systems was so interesting is that it really isn't that kind of to do things more sustainably. We need an inferior product or we have to make a ton of sacrifices. Obviously cost curves and all that are something to be worked through. But yeah, it's really interesting to have a narrative that's like, we can have all the chemicals and the fundamental building blocks of the world around us, but just doing it more sustainably and like basically building it off of pollution that we don't want. But I'm curious, so I feel like over the past couple of years, the conversation has really shifted more in this direction and more towards, green materials can produce like higher performance and better value and all this kind of stuff. As you've been building CERT systems, have you noticed or seen kind of a shift in the conversation or the types of conversations you're having and how people think about green premiums and adopting some of these low carbon solutions?
I think what's interesting for us is when we've looked at where ethylene is currently used right now and markets where there already is a green premium, there are already like places where people are paying more for lower carbon products. So in Europe, there's a lot of policy around low carbon intensity packaging for like food and also personal like cosmetic products. They're looking at ways that they can produce that packaging that is still compatible and certified to be food safe and skin safe, or anything that's going to be touching your skin. It needs to be a certain quality. And a lot of challenges that they faced are with recycling. There's a lot of impurities in recycled components that are difficult to remove. And so they're having a hard time finding replacements for the packaging that they currently have. So that's one area that we see our products could directly feed into producing more sustainable packaging for food and cosmetic applications.
Yeah, that's really interesting that because of the high performance and the purity of what you're producing, it actually, there's a niche out there that requires that and can't be filled by some of the recycled materials. I'd love to hear your experience on the fundraising side of this. From what I've seen, it seems like you've made an incredible amount of progress, mainly with non-dilutive funding, like government grants and things like the XPRIZE. What has that experience been like, and kind of what lessons have you learned about building the capital stack around this company?
Yeah, so that's correct. To date, we've raised more than $6 million in non-dilutive funding, and we just recently opened our seed round, which will be our first equity round. So maybe to start with, being a Carbon XPRIZE finalist was a complete game changer for us. It gave us validation, visibility, and also momentum. And that opened a lot of access to networks in the clean tech community to continue developing and supporting our company. So we were introduced to accelerators and also corporates through that process. Beyond that, we also secured government grants and also the strategic partnerships with the corporates that we've been working with so far. And so the first grant that we received was through Natural Resources Canada, and it was the Breakthrough Energy Solutions Canada project. We've also received NRC IRAP, Next Generation Manufacturing Canada funds, and Eco Canada. And so that's a lot of the grants that we've been able to secure, but we've also been working with corporates to do those paid proof of concept and R&D projects, which has added to our capital stack. And we were also recipients of the Breakthrough Energy Fellowship, which was huge for us. It acted as a non-dilutive pre-seed round for us. And that's what really accelerated the development of our technology and our team. It gave us the capital to grow out and actually build a lab space where we could build our pilots and larger reactors. So all of these resources have really helped us. And then we've also leveraged the SHRED tax credits, which are really great here in Canada,
right,
to make the most out of our R&D dollars.
It's really incredible you've been able to pull all of this together, and that the support has been around this, because I talk to a lot of kind of hard tech startups, and it's very difficult to find this funding and like land the grants and all of that. Looking back on kind of the journey so far, any big takeaways or lessons from that process that you think other hard tech founders could benefit from?
I think joining accelerator programs was one of the things that led to our success in terms of a lot of these grants. I mean, being academics, we had experience writing grants, but for things like the Breakthrough Energy Fellows program, that was something that we got nominated for through the Carbon to Value Initiative, through Mars, and through other mentors that we had met through the networks that we had built. Really joining those accelerators helped get us tapped into a bunch of the clean tech communities across North America. And that has been really instrumental in terms of like introductions and support throughout our journey.
That's really great. Yeah, it's interesting once you like getting access to that network can play such an outsized role in unlocking all of these different opportunities.
It's huge. Like the amount of inbound requests we got once we finished the XPRIZE and once we participated in these different accelerators was just like a game changer for us.
Yeah. I wanted to maybe understand a little bit or hear your perspective on moving from academia into startup world. There was a quote from you that was like, you always wanted to work in a startup. And I don't know if that's true, but maybe you could just tell me a little bit about what has that transition been like from, academia researching into now the world of startups and building this business out.
Yeah. So despite doing my PhD and postdoc, I never actually saw myself staying in academia. I think I just really enjoyed research and developing things. And part of the issue that I had with academia was sometimes I'd be working on a research project and I'd be like, what is the point of this? Like I publish a paper and then what happens?
Yeah.
And so being able to work on, a tangible product that we can see working in outside of the lab. And I think part of this was really accelerated by our experience in the XPRIZE, getting to take that technology out of the lab and like literally putting it into a field and seeing if it works was something that really like changed my perspective. And I was like, okay, this can have value and can be commercialized. So what are the steps that we need to take to do that? And I mean, coming from academia, I didn't immediately know those steps, but having that piloting experience was definitely a lot of knowledge that we gained in such a short amount of time. And then the supports that we've had through the accelerator programs, mentors, advisors who have had that experience with taking technology from the lab into industry has been really helpful in guiding us on our next steps towards commercialization.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it seems like getting from research institutions to commercialization is very difficult. There's a lot of kind of conversations how Canada struggles with that. Would love to hear your kind of reflections on, or maybe even thoughts for like if you were talking to other researchers or people going into kind of a research opportunity, what do you think people should be thinking about to kind of maybe like plant the seed on commercialization or getting ready for that?
Yeah, so I think our universities could probably be doing a better job at educating students on the different opportunities there are after school. I think there's two major paths that I was given, and it was academia or industry, like big industry. And I didn't even think of entrepreneurship during my undergrad or PhD.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe it was my fault. I probably could have researched more, but I think introducing entrepreneurship classes at the grad level is really important to kind of have people understand like the research that they're working on has purpose and has commercial value, and kind of making that connection is really important. And I think universities are definitely doing a better job than when I was in university doing that. There's a lot more entrepreneurship integrated into programs now. But I think like also having all the support networks there, because, starting a company is really difficult. There's a lot of resources that you no longer have access to once you leave the university, the infrastructure, all the overhead items, people, doing all of your accounting for you and stuff. And so teaching people like, these are the items you need to get started. And here's a facility that will help give you, lab space or these kind of resources that you need to get started, I think it should be integrated more at the university level.
Yeah. No, I love that. Having like a better off-ramp for that seems like a really important step. Just like, hey, you have promising research. Let's start getting you on a path to thinking about commercialization.
Definitely. There's a lot of great IP that's coming out of Canadian universities, and it's either getting stuck or it's getting taken up by foreign companies. And so I think we really have an opportunity to leverage all our great minds and, take that IP out of the university, create more startups, and get that environment more thriving in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe outside of the academic perspective, what are some of the other big players in the ecosystem that you've found particularly helpful or have been really useful in your kind of journey building CERT?
Yeah, so I mean, right now I'm in the Mars Women in Clean Tech program, and that's been a really good experience. We just started the cohort in September, but, connecting to other female founders has been really awesome. Being a founder can be a very isolating experience and difficult. And sometimes you're like, oh my gosh, I'm the only one in the entire world that's dealing with this. And just being able to talk to other people, even though our technology is completely different, and recognizing that we're going through similar struggles and we can help each other out on how to navigate those issues. It's been really great. So finding those networks within like these kinds of programs, basically all of the accelerators we've joined, we've become friends with the other companies that are there. And I think it's just a really good support system.
Yeah, that's great. I've heard so many people say similar things about just networks in general, but definitely the Mars Women in Clean Tech seems to be an extremely tight-knit crew. So maybe we can zoom out a little bit and back on the CERT side. If we look at, like, this seems like a huge opportunity to reduce the carbon intensity of chemicals, to do something with carbon pollution. What do you think we need to do to kind of 10x the growth of this sector and really make these kind of like next generation chemicals scale?
Yeah, so I think we need continued investment in these technologies. So pre-seed, seed, Series A, like throughout the entire development process of the company, and also infrastructure support to help advance the technology through the technology readiness levels. I think having, the piloting sites like we had at the XPRIZE was crucial for us deploying the technology there, because they had like a carbon capture unit right on site. And that's something that all of the teams used for their CO2 utilization technologies. And that's not something that we're going to invest in. That's a lot of money, or operate. And so having those kind of facilities where there's all the industrial power and water and any other feedstocks you need right there is really helpful for, piloting and continuing to develop the technologies. We also need supportive policies that demand more sustainable chemicals and derivatives. Right now, there aren't really many policies surrounding the chemical sector. There's some on plastics that are coming into play, and then fuels and also like building materials, but less on chemicals themselves. So that's another area that I think there could be more support through policies. And then we also need corporates willing to commit to lower carbon products, and that will help accelerate the adoption of these products on the larger scale.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On the policy front, are there any areas that you look to as doing it really well? You mentioned kind of Europe is doing some stuff around packaging. Any like exemplary models that you've seen for low carbon chemicals?
So far we haven't seen a lot.
Yeah, okay.
So far we've seen Europe has some proposed policies, but not any that have been actually legislated or have come into play yet.
Yeah, it does kind of seem like an area that flies under the radar a bit. And I think other sectors are kind of getting a bit more attention, maybe because consumers interact with them more, and chemicals are almost like invisible building blocks you don't really think about. Yeah. But it also is the building block for all of this stuff. So as you've been talking to partners, probably some investors, those conversations are starting. What's one thing you find people misunderstand about the space, or you just wish more people understood?
I think people underestimate the market for sustainable ethylene. I think people see the ethylene market as, it's hugely commoditized right now, and they kind of see it as daunting to penetrate with sustainable ethylene. So that is one thing that we navigate. We've already seen that there are sustainable uses of ethylene out there. And so trying to convince others that there is a willingness to invest in this technology and try to make more sustainable ethylene.
Interesting. Okay. So it's kind of an assumption that industry isn't going to adopt it unless there's like strict rules in place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, those were kind of all of my main questions. I'll wrap up with maybe just a quick rapid fire. So don't need to give too much thought to these answers, nice and easy.
Okay.
So first one, what's one thing you're really excited about for the year ahead?
So I think we're doing a lot of technical development this year, so scaling to our commercial cell size. And then also we're getting a lab scale pilot where we will be able to do all the separation of our ethylene to create like a pure ethylene product, which is really exciting for us.
Very cool. Okay. And then what's like a book, podcast, et cetera, that you'd recommend for folks listening?
I mean, I recently read Let My People Go Surfing by Yvonne Chouinard.
Nice.
And I really like that book. It's really fascinating how he built Patagonia.
Yeah. And then what's a piece of advice you would offer to folks looking to build something like CERT?
I think building a strong team around you is really important, especially for hard tech. You can't do it alone, unlike software. And so building a team who share a passion for what you're doing and are committed to working together towards that vision, I think is super important. And we've been really lucky to hire and work with a bunch of people who share our same passion towards creating sustainable chemicals. And that's really been a game changer for us.
Love it. Okay. And then any final ask for folks that are listening?
I guess if you are a climate tech, hard tech seed stage investor and you're interested in sustainable ethylene, please reach out to us.
Fantastic. Well, Christine, thanks so much for spending some time with us and sharing what you're working on at CERT. It's super interesting. Thanks for coming on. This was a really good conversation.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Justin. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.